Chapter 1. Devotion is a fragile shield when the dark decides to hunt. Odelia had spent her entire life kneeling before the frost-pale altars of the Moon Temple, trading her freedom for divine grace. She believed purity was an impenetrable fortress. She was tragically wrong. Tonight that fortress was burning. Smoke stung her eyes. The sharp strike of colliding steel echoed through the sacred corridors, a violent symphony tearing apart her sanctuary. Odelia hitched up the heavy layers of her ceremonial white gown. Her bare feet slipped on the polished marble as she fled the inner sanctum. Her final vows were meant to bind her to the light for eternity. The ceremony had been interrupted before the last blessing could be spoken. Instead of salvation, the shadows reached out to claim her. She darted around a towering marble pillar in the eastern wing, desperate to reach the catacombs. Panic clouded her vision. She never saw the obstacle in her path. The impact stole every ounce of air from her lungs. Odelia crashed into a solid barrier of muscle and dark leather. The collision sent her stumbling backward, her veil slipping from her hair. Before her knees could hit the ground, iron-bound hands clamped around her wrists, halting her fall with startling ease. Then, the scent hit her. It was a storm of crushed pine, burning embers, and untamed earth. The fragrance bypassed her logic, sinking directly into her marrow. A violent static erupted in her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Once, twice. A sudden sweeping heat flooded her lower belly, melting the frost she had cultivated in her soul for 19 years. Odelia gasped, forcing her chin up. He was an imposing force of nature. Dark hair fell over sharp, ruthless features, carved from violence and authority. But it was his eyes that stopped her dead. They burned with a molten predatory gold, an alpha, the sworn enemy of her order. He was the commander leading this siege, the beast her high priestess had warned them about. She needed to pull away. Her mind screamed at her to fight, to invoke the holy prayers of rejection. Yet her fingers curled involuntarily into the fabric of his dark tunic. The heat radiating from his chest was a narcotic. Her body softened, swaying toward him. She prayed to the goddess to cleanse her mind, to banish this sudden, terrifying craving. But her flesh had already made its choice. Vane went utterly still. The sounds of the raid, the shouting, the crumbling stone, the clash of weapons dissolved into a sudden silence. The world narrowed to the trembling woman in his grasp. He stared down at her wide, terrified eyes. The scent of white lily and sacred incense wrapped around his throat like a velvet rope. His golden pupils dilated until they nearly swallowed the iris. The primal obsession radiating from him became a physical pressure in the corridor. He had come to this temple to shatter its defenses and steal its relics. He never expected to find his soul tethered to a creature of the light. A low territorial vibration built in his chest. His thumbs brushed over the frantic pulse leaping at her wrists. The delicate flutter of her heart fed the ancient dominant beast beneath his skin. She was terrified. She was holy. She was his. Unhand the priestess. The command shattered the spell. A dozen temple guards flooded the corridor from the opposite archway. Silver-tipped spears leveled directly at Vane's broad back. The holy knights formed a tight, lethal half-circle, their armor catching the glow of the burning tapestries. "Release her, beast, or face the goddess's wrath," the captain ordered, stepping forward. The metallic scrape of boots on marble signaled their closing trap. Vane did not even glance over his shoulder. The overwhelming threat of the armed guards meant absolutely nothing. His focus remained entirely consumed by Odelia. He released her wrists, only to slide his large, calloused hands up her arms. He traced the delicate line of her shoulders before tangling his fingers deep into her dark, unbound hair. Odelia trembled, her breath catching in a shallow gasp. "Please," she whispered. She did not know if she was begging him to let her go or pleading for him to pull her closer. The sacrilege of her own desires brought tears of shame to her eyes. Every doctrine she had ever learned demanded she recoil. Every instinct buried in her blood demanded she submit. Vane's expression darkened with absolute possession. He stepped into her space, crowding her against the cold marble wall. The titanic weight of his presence trapped her completely, shielding her from the chaos of the temple while simultaneously becoming the greatest danger she had ever faced. "Your goddess cannot have you, Jaoin," Vane murmured. His voice was a brutal, silken rumble that vibrated straight through her bones. He tilted her face upward, his golden eyes blazing with a hunger that defied heaven and earth. "You are mine." He crushed his mouth against hers. It was not a gentle request. It was an absolute conquest. The kiss tasted of fire and ruin, demanding her surrender with ruthless precision. Odelia whimpered against his lips, her hands rising to push his chest away. Instead, her fingers tangled in his shirt, clutching him like a lifeline in the dark. The sacred world she knew crumbled to ash, replaced by the terrifying, intoxicating heat of the wolf who had just stolen her from the gods. And just like that, everything she believed in shattered. The sacred vows, the gods she trusted. None of them could silence what burned inside her now. Because the moment his lips touched hers, something far more dangerous than fate awakened. But what happens when a holy woman becomes the Alpha King's greatest weakness, or his most powerful obsession? If you want to see what he does next, don't forget to subscribe. And let's step into Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The gilded cage was still a cage. Odelia sat on the edge of the sprawling velvet mattress, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. 3 days had passed since the raid on the Moon Temple. 3 days since she had been stolen from the marble halls and locked inside the warlord's private chambers. She stared at the tray of untouched food resting on the mahogany table. Roasted meats, fresh bread, and dark wine sat entirely ignored. Her stomach twisted with a hollow ache, but she refused to surrender. The hunger strike was not a rebellion against her captor. It was a punishment for herself. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of his mouth crashing against hers replayed in vivid, humiliating detail. She had kissed him back. The holy priestess, dedicated to the light, had melted into the shadow's embrace. The guilt was a suffocating pressure. If she starved the flesh, perhaps she could starve the treacherous desires lurking within it. A wave of dizziness hit her. Odelia leaned sideways, her vision blurring at the edges. Her strength was finally failing. The heavy oak door swung open. Vane stepped into the room. He wore no armor today, only a loose dark shirt that highlighted the broad, imposing lines of his shoulders. His golden eyes immediately locked onto the untouched tray of food, then shifted to her pale, trembling form. The air in the room grew instantly dense, charged with a predatory tension. He crossed the floor in 3 long strides. Odelia shrank back against the headboard, expecting anger. She anticipated the brutal warlord who had conquered her sanctuary. Instead, Vane stopped beside the bed. He let out a slow, controlled breath. The veins in his forearms strained against his skin, a physical testament to the immense restraint he was exercising. He did not yell. He did not demand. He reached for the tray, picking up a warm piece of bread and a slice of roasted meat. Then he sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped beneath his hulking weight. "You are fading," Vane said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that made her pulse skip. "I will not allow you to waste away in my bed." "I do not want your food," Odelia whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "I want my freedom." "You want absolution," he corrected smoothly, his gaze piercing straight through her defenses. "You are starving yourself because you liked the way I touched you. You are trying to kill the part of you that is mine." A hot flush crept up her neck. "I belong to the goddess." Vane leaned closer. The scent of pine and wild earth washed over her, scrambling her thoughts. "The goddess left you to burn. I pulled you from the fire." He lifted the food toward her lips. When she turned her head away, his free hand moved. Long, calloused fingers gently cupped her jaw. The touch was painfully tender, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of. He stroked her cheekbone, his thumb catching a stray tear she hadn't realized she shed. Odelia shuddered. He was a monster. He was the enemy. Yet as his thumb traced her lower lip, coaxing her to part them, she realized a terrifying truth. He was the only person who had ever looked at her as a woman, rather than a vessel for divine prayers. "Eat," he commanded softly, "or I will feed you from my own mouth." The threat sent a jolt of liquid heat straight to her core. Defeated by her own traitorous biology, she parted her lips and took a small bite. Vane watched her chew with rapt, obsessive attention. He fed her slowly, piece by piece, his golden eyes tracking every movement of her throat. When the meal was finished, he produced a small jar of herbal salve. Without asking for permission, he gently took her ankle, inspecting the scrapes she had earned while fleeing the temple. His touch was a soothing balm, easing the sting of her cuts. The alpha of the shadow armies was kneeling at the edge of the bed, tending to her wounds with reverent care. The contradiction tore her mind apart. Every second near him felt like a sin, and she was rapidly starting to crave it. Once he was satisfied, Vane stood up. His jaw was locked, his breathing visibly shallow. The effort of keeping his hands off her was tearing his control to shreds. Without another word, he turned and left the room, the lock clicking firmly behind him. Hours later, the moon rose high above the fortress. Odelia lay restless in the dark. A strange, metallic grinding sound echoed from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It was followed by a low, agonizing groan. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable pull, Odelia slipped out of bed. She noticed the bedroom door had not latched properly when Vane left. Pushing it open, she stepped into the silent, stone-walled corridor. The groaning grew louder, leading her toward a narrow stairwell that descended into the fortress's underbelly. She crept down the spiraling steps, her bare feet silent against the cold rock. The air grew damp and heavy. At the bottom, an iron-wrought gate stood slightly ajar. Odelia peered through the gaps. Her breath hitched. The underground chamber was bathed in dim torchlight. Vane was chained to the center of the room. Thick silver restraints bound his wrists to the stone floor. He was shirtless, his back arching in absolute agony. His body convulsed as something inside him broke loose. Dark veins pulsed violently across his skin, fighting an invisible pressure crushing his mind. The curse. The high priestess had spoken of the shadow curse that tormented the Alpha bloodline, a madness that demanded violence and blood. Vane struck the stone floor with his fists, gasping for air. His fangs elongated, his eyes burning with an unstable, feral light. He was losing the battle against his own nature. Then, a ragged, desperate sound tore from his throat. It was a roar of pure anguish that echoed off the damp walls. Odelia! He was growling her name in the dark, a mad, possessive plea to the only light that could anchor his fractured soul. And just like that, everything she believed in shattered. The sacred vows, the gods she trusted. None of them could silence what burned inside her now, because the moment his lips touched hers, something far more dangerous than fate awakened. But what happens when a holy woman becomes the Alpha King's greatest weakness or his most powerful obsession? If you want to see what he does next, don't forget to subscribe. And let's step into Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The iron rattled against the damp stone. Odelia stood frozen at the threshold of the subterranean cell. The torchlight danced across Vane's shoulders, painting the violent spasms of his muscles in harsh relief. He was breaking apart. The curse coiled beneath his skin like liquid midnight, fighting to consume the man and leave only a mindless beast behind. Her pulse throbbed in her throat. Doctrine dictated she let the monster suffer. Her teachings demanded she turn away from the darkness. Instead, her bare feet stepped onto the freezing floor of the cage. The air smelled of metallic rust and primal fear. He jerked at the sound of her approach. His eyes found hers through the gloom. The amber gaze was fractured, unstable, bordering on pure feral instinct. A terrifying rumble vibrated in his chest. It was a warning to stay back. Odelia did not stop. The invisible tether pulling her toward him was stronger than any holy scripture. She knelt beside his chained form. The heat radiating from his torso rivaled a blazing hearth. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. When her palm finally pressed against the center of his chest, a profound pressure shifted in the room. A soft, luminous warmth bled from her fingertips. It sank into his flesh. The dark, corrupted veins paused their frantic assault. Vane released a sharp, broken exhale. His towering frame went rigid, then slowly melted into her touch. The tension bled out of his muscles. He closed his eyes, leaning his skull toward her shoulder. Every second near him felt like sin, and she was starting to crave it. Days bled into nights within the fortress walls. Vane no longer locked her in the sprawling bedroom. Instead, he kept her tethered to his side. They moved through the imposing corridors together. The proximity was a slow, exquisite torture. He demanded her presence at meals, during his strategy meetings, and even in the quiet hours of the afternoon. She observed the way his dominant figure commanded every space. When they stood in the vast library studying old maps, the distance between them evaporated. He would step up behind her, close enough that she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her spine. The scent of pine and rain enveloped her, drowning out her logic. Odelia tried to focus on the parchment. Her knees weakened. The primal pull was undeniable. Her body leaned backward, unconsciously seeking his solid heat. Vane lowered his head. She felt the ghost of his breath against the sensitive curve of her neck. He inhaled deeply, drinking in her scent like a man dying of thirst. The friction of his closeness sent static racing through her veins. He wanted to claim her. The obsession was palpable in the air, thick and overwhelming. She tilted her head, granting him access, a silent invitation. He froze. A harsh sound tore from his throat. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle ticked beneath his skin. With a violent exertion of will, the Alpha forced himself to step back. The sudden absence of his heat left Odelia shivering. He was terrified of breaking her. The ruthless conqueror possessed an iron-bound restraint when it came to her fragile human form. The realization terrified Odelia more than his wrath ever could. Her holy faith was collapsing, replaced by a dark, consuming devotion to the wolf. The breaking point arrived under the cloak of a moonless night. A thunderstorm raged outside the fortress. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows of the study. The hearth fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the rugs. Odelia stood by the glass, watching the storm blur the horizon. Her mind was a chaotic tempest of its own. Vane stepped into the room. The shadows seemed to cling to his boots. Silence stretched between them, loaded with unspoken demands. He crossed the floor with slow, deliberate strides. He stopped inches from her. The atmosphere in the study compressed, squeezing the air from her lungs. Odelia turned to face him. The golden intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. There was no escape. She no longer wanted one. "You are fighting it," Vane murmured. His voice was a dark, silken threat that stroked along her nerves. "I am a priestess," she whispered. The defense sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. He lifted a hand, sliding his knuckles down the side of her neck. "You are mine." The declaration shattered the final remnants of her resistance. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his dark tunic. She pulled him downward. Vane groaned, a deep, possessive sound that rattled her bones. He framed her face with both hands, tilting her head up. His mouth descended, hovering a breath away from hers. The anticipation was a physical ache. Then the heavy oak doors of the study exploded inward. Wood splintered and flew across the room. The deafening crash echoed like thunder. Odelia gasped, spinning around. A figure stood in the ruined doorway, silhouetted by the lightning flashing in the corridor. Silver armor gleamed. The crest of the moon temple caught the dim light. It was Thane, the captain of the Holy Guard. "Lady Odelia," Thane shouted, raising a gleaming broadsword. "Step away from the beast. I am here to deliver you from the dark." The quiet intimacy of the room vanished. The temperature dropped drastically. Vane did not step back. He stepped in front of her, shielding her entirely with his colossal frame. The air around him distorted, his spine elongated, shoulders expanding as a horrific, predatory sound ripped through the silence. Claws tore through his boots. Dark, smoke-like fur erupted along his forearms. He shifted into his half-wolf form. The lethal pressure in the room became unbearable. Vane turned his glowing, demonic eyes toward the intruder. A primal snarl shook the stone walls, promising absolute ruin. Chapter 4. The collision of silver and shadow shattered the study's quiet. Thane swung his broadsword with righteous fury. The blade cut a deadly arc through the air, aimed directly at the beast's chest. Vane moved like a phantom. He stepped effortlessly inside the weapon's trajectory. The sheer force of the Alpha's counterstrike sent the holy captain flying backward. The impact echoed like a thunderclap. Stone fractured beneath the knight's heavy armor. Thane gasped, struggling to push himself up from the ruined floorboards. Vane advanced. The Alpha was a hulking silhouette of pure predatory instinct. His golden eyes locked onto his target with lethal precision. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. The scent of ozone and impending doom flooded the space. Pressure built violently in Odelia's skull. She could not let this happen. She could not let the warlord become a murderer for her sake. Nor could she stand by and watch her former comrade perish in the dark. "Stop!" Odelia cried out. She threw herself between them, extending her bare hands blindly. A terrifying pressure built within her chest. It was not the cool, serene grace of the moon goddess she had prayed to all her life. It was raw, blistering heat. The sensation clawed up her throat, demanding release. A blinding eruption of golden light tore from her palms. The sheer magnitude of the blast consumed the room. It was searing, relentless sunlight. The illumination forced Thane to the ground, shielding his face in absolute terror. Vane was driven back. He crossed his iron-bound arms to block the blinding radiance. The study's dark velvet tapestries curled and blackened under the intense, abnormal heat. Odelia collapsed to her knees. Her fingertips smoked with residual energy. A hollow void opened in her chest, replacing everything she thought she knew. She stared at her own glowing hands in abject horror. This was not holy magic. It was pure destruction. From the fallen knight's armor, a shimmering projection arose. The sacred amulet around Thane's neck projected an ethereal silver phantom into the ruined room. The illusion of the high priestess looked down at Odelia with cold, calculating detachment. "The vessel has finally awakened," the phantom's voice echoed. The sound carried no warmth, only a clinical, terrifying satisfaction. "You thought yourself a servant of the light, Odelia. You are nothing but a container." Static rushed through Odelia's veins. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ached. "What are you saying?" "You are a sun-witch hybrid," the phantom declared coldly. "An abomination of the old world. We raised you, kept you pure, only for the coming astronomical alignment. You are the sacrifice." The phantom flickered, a cruel sneer marking its aged face. "When the sun and moon align, we will burn you upon the pyre to strip the alpha lineage of their power. You are never holy. You are our weapon against the dark." The projection faded into nothingness. The silence that followed was deafening. Odelia stared at the scorched floorboards, her identity shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her faith was a meticulously crafted lie. The temple had not saved her. They had primed her for slaughter. She was a monster, a walking harbinger of ruin disguised in a white gown. She looked up at Thane. The knight who had sworn to protect the innocent was trembling violently. He stared at her not with reverence, but with utter disgust. He scrambled backward, terrified of the abomination kneeling before him. "Stay away from me," Thane choked out, his eyes wide with revulsion. He scrambled to his feet and fled into the storm, abandoning his holy mission, abandoning her. Odelia shrank into herself. The blistering heat still rolled off her skin in unstable waves. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for Vane to realize what she truly was, a weapon forged to destroy his kind. She expected a fatal blow. She anticipated the brutal rejection of the Alpha. A heavy footstep sounded against the stone. Then another. Vane did not run. He approached with slow, deliberate strides. The residual sunlight radiating from her skin singed the edges of his dark clothing. The heat was suffocating, a physical barrier meant to keep the shadows at bay. He did not care. The towering warlord dropped to his knees directly in front of her. Odelia squeezed her eyes tighter. "Don't touch me," she sobbed, her voice fracturing under the weight of her betrayal. "I will burn you. I am a monster." "Open your eyes," Vane commanded gently. She obeyed, her vision swimming with hot tears. His golden eyes held no fear. There was no disgust, no hesitation. There was only absolute, unshakable devotion. He reached out. His large palms framed her blazing cheeks. The scorching heat bit into his calloused flesh, but he did not flinch. He leaned in, wrapping his imposing arms around her trembling frame. The crushing weight of his embrace grounded her instantly. He absorbed her fire into his shadows, pulling her against the steady, thundering rhythm of his heart. "You are not their weapon," Vane murmured against her hair. His voice was an unyielding anchor in the storm. "You are my mate." The last remnants of her holy indoctrination crumbled to dust. The primal tension that had stretched between them shifted. It deepened into a profound, unbreakable resonance of the soul. She was not a priestess. She was not a sacrifice. She belonged here, wrapped in the dark, held by the wolf who accepted her searing flames without question. She buried her face in his chest. A ragged sob tore from her throat. Vane held her tighter, his chin resting on top of her head. He let her break apart against him. He offered his titanic strength to hold her shattered pieces together, soothing the frantic trembling of her limbs. The protective cage of his arms felt like the only safe place left in a ruined world. But as the warmth of his acceptance washed over her, a new, icy terror settled in the pit of her stomach. The high priestess's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. The astronomical alignment, the solar eclipse. It was only 3 days away. Her awakened blood was a beacon. The entire holy army would march upon Umbraxis to reclaim their weapon. If she stayed, she would not just burn on their pyre. She would drag Vane and his entire kingdom into absolute ruin. Her existence was his doom. Chapter 5. The ashes of her holy life settled over the scorched floorboards. Odelia remained in his arms. The relentless thrum of his heartbeat against her cheek was a cruel lullaby. He held her as if his titanic strength alone could shield her from destiny. But destiny was not a physical enemy he could tear apart. It was a poison, carried in her own awakened veins. Vane's breathing slowed. The violent adrenaline of the fight faded, replaced by the exhausting weight of his cursed blood. The dark lines along his neck receded. She felt his guard lower completely. He trusted her. His soul had anchored itself to hers in the span of a few impossible days. That absolute trust broke her heart. She lifted her hands. Her fingertips brushed the sharp, unyielding line of his jaw, trailing upward to rest against his temples. "You are my only light," she whispered into the quiet dark. Then she pushed. Instead of the soothing warmth she usually offered, she channeled the suffocating, blinding essence of the sun. It was not a physical strike. It was a swift, overwhelming overload to his heightened senses. Vane's golden eyes snapped wide in shock. His iron-bound grip tightened on her waist for a fraction of a second, instinctively trying to pull her closer. Then his pupils dilated into blackness. The colossal alpha slumped forward. Odelia caught his weight. She lowered his imposing frame gently to the ruined rugs, letting his head rest against the floor. Her hands did not shake. She shed no tears. Grief was a luxury for those who planned to survive. She unfastened the silver moon crest from her collar. It was a hollow symbol of a fabricated faith, but it was the only piece of her old life she had left. She pressed the cold metal into his broad palm, folding his slack fingers over it. She stood up. The frozen air of the corridor bit through her thin gown. She walked away without looking back. The storm outside had softened into a freezing, miserable drizzle. Thane knelt in the courtyard mud, clutching his fractured ribs. He looked up as Odelia emerged from the fortress shadows. His expression was a fractured mosaic of terror and revulsion. He scrambled backward, expecting her to burn him to ash. "Take me back," Odelia commanded. Her voice held no holy grace. It was entirely dead. "Take me to the pyre." Hours later, the shadows in the study stretched long and sharp. Vane woke to the freezing chill of empty air. He surged upward. His chest heaved, pulling in desperate breaths. The scent of lily and summer heat was entirely gone. The room smelled only of ozone and abandoned stone. He looked down. The silver crest bit into his palm. The betrayal struck deeper than any weapon. It bypassed his flesh and fractured his soul. She had tricked him. She had used the very magic he embraced to knock him into oblivion. She chose to die. The realization resonated through his hollow chest, a brutal, suffocating drumbeat. She chose to die instead of choosing him. A low, terrifying vibration built in his throat. It was not mere anger. It was the sound of a world ending. The agonizing roar of a broken mate tore through the fortress, shaking the ancient masonry to its foundations. The sound carried pure, distilled loss. It was the cry of a beast, stripped of its only salvation. Moments later, the warlord stood on the high battlements. The freezing wind whipped his dark hair. His generals gathered in absolute silence, feeling the crushing pressure of their alpha's shattered mind. The atmosphere was lethal. "Summon the horde," Vane ordered. His voice was a flat, uncompromising promise of ruin. "We march on the moon temple. Leave no stone standing." The sky above the holy mountain bruised into shades of violent violet and ash gray. The astronomical alignment had begun. The moon slowly crawled across the burning face of the sun, casting an eerie, unnatural twilight over the vast courtyard. Odelia lay flat against the freezing marble of the sacrificial altar. Thick iron chains bound her wrists and ankles. The metal bit into her skin, but she felt nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the darkening sky. She did not struggle. She did not weep. She had accepted the void to ensure Vane's survival. Hundreds of chanting priests circled the towering dais. Their voices merged into a droning, hypnotic hum that vibrated through the stone beneath her spine. At the head of the altar stood the high priestess. Her silken robes whipped in the sudden chilling wind caused by the dropping temperature. "The vessel returns her stolen light," the high priestess proclaimed. The fanaticism in her voice echoed across the silent mountain. She raised her hand high above her head. A ceremonial dagger was clutched tightly in her grasp. The blade gleamed with a slick, emerald poison. It caught the last dying ray of sunlight slipping past the moon's edge. The shadow swallowed the sun completely. Total suffocating darkness fell over the world. The high priestess swung the blade downward. Chapter 6. The emerald blade descended. It caught the eclipse's unnatural twilight, plunging toward her chest. Then the mountain fractured. A deafening impact obliterated the sacrificial altar. The sheer kinetic force threw the high priestess backward into the chanting crowd. Stone dust choked the freezing air. From the settling debris, a titanic shadow rose. Vane did not arrive as a king. He arrived as a beast. His hulking wolf form was a nightmare woven from midnight and rage. He stood directly over Odelia's chained body, a colossal shield of muscle and dark fur. A roar ripped from his chest. The sound was so physically punishing it shattered the remaining stained glass windows of the temple. The atmospheric pressure plummeted. Priests collapsed, clutching their ringing ears. The holy army swarmed the dais. Vane met them with devastating momentum. He did not fight to conquer. He fought only to reach her. Imposing strikes sent armored knights flying into the marble pillars. The impact echoed through the courtyard, a heavy, leaden thud of falling bodies. He shifted back to his human shape, ignoring the onslaught around him. His hands grasped the iron-bound restraints holding Odelia. Metal groaned and snapped under his overwhelming strength. "I have you," he breathed, pulling her against his chest. The world around them dissolved into chaos. Odelia gripped his tunic, her fingers digging into the dark fabric. His scent, pine, rain, and fierce devotion flooded her senses, anchoring her fractured mind. But the high priestess had risen. Her face was twisted with fanatical fury. She chanted a forbidden syllable. The air warped. A concentrated sphere of lethal lunar magic materialized between her palms. It shot across the courtyard, silent and deadly, aimed directly at Odelia's defenseless back. Vane saw the light distort. He did not hesitate. The towering warlord twisted, throwing his entire body between Odelia and the magical strike. The blast hit him dead center. There was no sound of tearing flesh, only a terrifying vacuum-like silence as the spell imploded against his chest. The kinetic shockwave knocked the breath from Odelia's lungs. Vane's rigid posture broke. The absolute, unyielding strength of the Alpha vanished in an instant. He fell to his knees. Odelia dropped with him, catching his collapsing weight on the ruined altar. The ambient noise of the battle faded into static. Her hollow chest tightened painfully. "Vane," she whispered. The word tasted like ash. He looked up at her. The golden fire in his eyes was flickering, fading into a dull, quiet amber. There was no pain in his expression. There was no regret. He lifted a trembling hand. His callous thumb brushed the curve of her cheek, a touch so incredibly soft it defied the violence around them. He had traded his kingdom, his life, his very soul for her. And he would do it again. His hand slipped from her face. His eyes stared past her, seeing nothing. The invisible tether connecting their souls, the vibrant, pulsing mate bond, snapped. It was a physical severing. A freezing void erupted inside Odelia's core, ripping away the warmth, the security, the profound connection that had redefined her existence. She knelt on the shattered stone, cradling his lifeless head in her lap. The high priestess approached, flanked by recovering guards. "Take the abomination," she commanded. "The beast is dead." Odelia did not weep. The sorrow expanding in her veins hit a sudden, absolute limit. The freezing void inside her chest inverted. It became a blistering, catastrophic furnace. The eclipse broke. A single piercing ray of sunlight struck her back. She absorbed it entirely. Odelia stood up. Her eyes burned with a terrifying, incandescent white light. The grief morphed into apocalyptic rage. She released a soundless scream, unleashing a searing, omnidirectional shockwave of pure, solar energy. The overwhelming heat instantly dissolved the approaching guards into blinding light. The pressure flattened the remaining holy army, turning their sacred courtyard into a lake of blinding, destructive fire. She expended every drop of her life force into the blast. As the light consumed the temple, her knees finally gave out, and she collapsed into the dark beside her fallen mate. Chapter 7. Ash drifted from the fractured sky like gray snow. The blinding inferno had burned itself out, leaving nothing but a vast, terrifying silence in its wake. The sacred courtyard was a flattened wasteland of melted stone and shadow. The holy army, the high priestess, the oppressive doctrines of a lifetime, all erased by a single, catastrophic eruption of sunlight. Odelia lay motionless on the ruined dais. The blazing furnace inside her chest had gone entirely dark. Her life force was a frayed thread, slipping rapidly into the freezing void. Her vision narrowed to the unmoving silhouette of the warlord beside her. She reached out. Her fingertips, now completely cold, rested against his armor. There was no pulse. There was no warmth. She closed her eyes, welcoming the endless quiet. If the world demanded a sacrifice, she was ready to pay it. She would follow him into the dark. But sunlight is not merely a weapon of destruction. It is the oldest source of renewal. Deep within Vane's imposing form, the residual solar energy she had unleashed continued to work. The lethal lunar magic that had stopped his heart was systematically dismantled. The corrupted spell splintered, burning away under the lingering, purifying heat of his mate. A sudden violent shift in air pressure ruptured the stillness. A sharp, desperate intake of breath tore through the silence. Vane's chest heaved upward. His golden eyes snapped open. The Alpha surged to his knees. The catastrophic injury had vanished, leaving only torn fabric and the overwhelming scent of ozone. He was alive. The impossible had happened. But the triumph shattered the very second his gaze locked onto Odelia. She was fading. Her skin possessed a translucent, ghostly pallor. The faint, rhythmic flutter of her pulse was barely perceptible. Odelia. The name was a ragged, fractured sound. Vane scrambled across the scorched marble. He hauled her limp body into his lap, pulling her against his thundering chest. The absolute, unyielding commander of the Shadow Horde was trembling violently. Terror, raw and primal, eclipsed every other instinct. He had defied death, only to find his soul slipping through his fingers. "No," he growled, the vibration vibrating through her fragile frame. "You do not get to leave me. Not after this." Her head lolled against his arm. She lacked the strength to open her eyes. The freezing emptiness was dragging her under. Vane did not hesitate. Human medicine could not save her. Holy prayers were useless ashes. Only the most ancient, dominant magic of his kind could anchor a fleeing soul. He had to bind her life force to his own. He had to tether her to the living world before the tether snapped permanently. He leaned down. The scent of pine and wild earth washed over her fading consciousness. His breath was a feverish heat against the sensitive curve of her neck. He did not ask for permission. He did not pause to consider the danger. Driven by an all-consuming devotion, the Alpha parted his lips and pressed his mouth to her throat. The claiming bite was not a gentle request. It was an absolute, unbreakable demand for her to stay. His teeth broke the surface of her skin, sinking into the pulse point with precise, desperate necessity. A blinding surge of energy exploded through Odelia's veins. The freezing void shattered. In its place, a colossal wave of liquid heat rushed directly into her heart. The severed mate bond reignited with the force of a falling star. It was a flawless two-way current of life, power, and overwhelming emotion. His soul crashed into hers, filling the empty, hollow spaces she had carried since childhood. She gasped, her back arching off his arm. Her eyes flew open. The blinding white light of the Sun Witch was gone. Instead, her irises reflected the deep, vibrant gold of the wolf who held her. Vane pulled back slowly. His chest heaved with the effort of the transfer. He stared down at her, his expression a mixture of profound relief and possessive awe. The mark on her neck throbbed with a steady, rhythmic heat, syncing her heartbeat perfectly to his own. "You are mine," he breathed, resting his forehead against hers, "in this life and the next." Odelia looked past his shoulder. The ruined statues of the moon goddess lay in pieces. The oppressive light that had dictated her every breath was permanently extinguished. She did not mourn it. She felt no guilt, no hesitation. The illusion was over. She lifted her hand, twining her fingers into his dark, ash-dusted hair. She pulled him closer, sealing the gap between their lips. She was never meant to belong to the light. She was meant to rule both worlds, with him. Months later, the remnants of the holy mountain were nothing but a memory. The towering architecture of Umbraxis had expanded, a seamless blend of obsidian stone and sprawling sunlit gardens. The fortress no longer felt like a cage to keep the world out. It was a sanctuary that commanded absolute respect. Odelia sat upon a throne of dark iron and polished silver. She wore no veils, no restrictive white gowns. Her dark dress draped elegantly over her frame, designed not to hide, but to empower. At her side, Vane stood with the unshakable presence of a king who had fought fate and won. His large hand rested possessively on the arm of her throne, his thumb brushing a slow, steady rhythm against her knuckles. Whenever she turned her head, the claiming mark on her neck was visible for all to see. It was not a brand of submission. It was a badge of ultimate triumph. The court below them moved with synchronized reverence. Witches and wolves, once sworn enemies, now operated within the same walls. They bowed to the Alpha, but they knelt for the Queen. Vane leaned down, his lips ghosting over the shell of her ear. The subtle contact sent a familiar, addictive static racing through her blood. "Are you content, my queen?" His voice was a low, silken rumble, meant for her alone. Odelia tilted her chin up, meeting his molten golden eyes. The undeniable primal gravity between them was as strong as the day they collided in the burning temple. She smiled, a sharp, confident expression that belonged entirely to the dark. "I have everything I ever wanted, Wedimo," she whispered. And in the end, she didn't belong to the light, and he was never meant to stay in the dark. Together, they became something the world had never seen before. Not a curse, not a mistake, but a love powerful enough to rewrite fate itself. If this story made you feel something, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more stories waiting for you here.